superstar in the room, Ms. Ann Farron. Can we all give her a round of applause? Hello. Thank you for being here, Ms. Farron. It's an honor. Thanks to all of you all for coming to this session this morning on mindfulness, contemplative practices in the learning environment. My name is Jarena Thomas, and I'm really honored to be here with three wonderful colleagues. To my left is Professor Michelle Levere from the University of the District of Columbia. To her left is Dr. Michelle Chapman, also from the University of the District of Columbia. And finally on the end is Professor Alyssa Margolin, who teaches here in the Health Studies Department at AU. I kind of straddle both. I teach here in SIS, and I also teach at the University of the District of Columbia. So it's an honor to be here. We really look forward to having a discussion with you all, for sharing our thoughts and our experiences, but also hearing from you. Before we get started, can I just get a pulse of the room? How many faculty do we have in the room? Faculty? Okay, how about students? A few students, and then staff? Okay, good. So I feel like we have a good mix here. And so we'll have a good conversation. So what we're going to do before we get going is to get ourselves centered. We're just going to take a few minutes to get ready for what we are about to learn. So I will pass it over to my colleague to help us do that, and then we will jump right in.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's great to be home. I completed graduate studies here at AU in anthropology. What's up, David? So this is wonderful. So we're going to begin with a jazz meditation, which is a contemplative practice that I use in my classes. I'll be playing the Spartacus love theme played by Ahmad Jamal. And so I invite you to just allow yourself to arrive, to enjoy the music, to get centered, to take a few deep breaths. We're all parked, we're all in the right room, and I think it's going to be a wonderful session. So, get myself ready. And typically we invite folks to just sit up nice and tall in their seats, but not rigid. And maybe take a couple of deep breaths. Maybe do some head rolls or whatever it is your body is calling for or needing at this moment. And we're just going to enjoy this music. Just notice your feet on the floor, spine nice and tall. Drop your shoulders, allow them to relax and fall away from your ears. Allow your face to be soft. Release the brow, wrinkle. Nice deep inhale, bringing that breath down to the diaphragm. Breathing out fully, a nice full exhale. Another slow, deep breath in. And exhale. Helps you center, you can repeat silently to yourself, I am here. I am here.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman, for leading us in that. Okay, everyone, I hope everyone is centered and ready to discuss. So, again, we're here. The session is entitled Mindfulness and Contemplative Practices in the Learning Environment. So here's our loose agenda. We'll adjust as needed. So we're going to do welcome and introductions. We're going to each do about 5 to 7 minutes of remarks of things that we want to share with you along the topic of mindfulness and contemplative practices individually. And then we'll move into a moderated presenter discussion. So based on what my colleagues here shared during their individual remarks, I'm going to moderate a short discussion, asking them to dive a little deeper into some of the themes that they've shared. Then we're going to have an open discussion with everyone in the room to answer questions, to ask questions, to share your experiences. We definitely want to hear from everyone. You know, everyone has a different experience with this, coming from a student perspective, a faculty perspective, a staff perspective, and we'd love to hear that and have an open dialogue. And then we will close with final remarks, and maybe if we have time, we'll have the privilege of Dr. Chapman leading us in another short closing contemplative practice. Okay, so with that, let me just move on real quick to why we're here. Here are our 3 learning objectives for this session. So the first is to explain the concepts of mindfulness and contemplative pedagogy. The second is to describe the potential benefits of mindfulness and contemplative practices for faculty and students in a learning setting, and I neglected to put staff there as well because it's equally important. And then finally, to incorporate in contemplative practices into teaching, to talk about some of those things and to share some ideas, and then to generate some ideas in the room for what you can do to adapt what you're already doing as a teacher or a learner or as a facilitator of learning in your work. So with that, I will move right into introducing myself very quickly and giving a 5-minute remarks. So again, my name is Jarena Thomas. My background is in national security and intelligence, and I teach those courses to undergrads and grad students. And what I find is that the type of students that are interested in that field tend to be a certain type, tend to be pretty type A, myself included, so I'm not casting aspersions. We tend to be somewhat tightly wound sometimes, very A-centered type of people, very focused people, and not always in tune with how we're feeling and how our biases and assumptions are impacting our analysis and the way that we're looking at these very important themes. National security themes, military themes, defense themes, crime, all those types of things don't always lend themselves to being aware and being mindful of the way that you're processing the information. So having observed this over time, I thought it was important to incorporate being mindful in my classroom. So I have this first quote up here, which is one of my favorite quotes from Jon Kabat-Zinn from the book Full Catastrophe Living. I don't know if anyone's had the pleasure of reading that book, but it's a fantastic book. And so the quote is, "Mindfulness is both nothing special and incredibly special, totally ordinary and completely extraordinary, all at the same time." And the reason I like that so much and that I share these ideas, maybe not so directly, but indirectly with my students, is that to me, mindfulness isn't meditation necessarily. Mindfulness isn't anything other than being aware of recognizing how you're feeling, recognizing your thoughts and why you think the things that you're thinking. Just really being aware and present. That's what mindfulness is. So it really, to me, isn't anything, it's not a phenomenal idea. It's just a very basic thing that we take for granted, and that as humans who are always coming and going and focused on what we're doing, we don't really stop to just be aware. And so it's a very powerful thing to do, but it's also something very basic at the same time. So with my students, I teach them, for example, I have an intelligence analysis class that I teach. And in intelligence analysis, it's a lot of cognitive skill sets. How to look at information, how to break it down, how to identify your biases. And so I found that weaving in mindful practices and contemplative practices and ideas that are undergirded with mindfulness really jives, that's not the right word, really aligns very well with teaching these cognitive practices. So I tell my students to, as the second bullet says here, to know yourself, know your customer, and customer and national security lingo is the person you're producing intelligence for. So be it the president, be it the head of the FBI, be it whoever, that's your customer. And then know your stuff. And so how I tie mindfulness concepts into this is, I say, first of all, you need to know yourself. So you need to be aware of what you're coming to the content with. So if we're dealing with, say we're dealing with Iran now, right? Iran's all over the news. So if my students, if I give them a project to analyze what's going on here, tell me forecast, tell me what you think might be some potential outcomes here. I ask them to first really understand yourself and understand what you're coming to the table with. Do you already have some preconceived notions about Iran or Iranian people or the Iranian government? Do you have any assumptions that are already ingrained that you're bringing to the table first? So I help them to break that down and really understand themselves first. Think about how they feel when we talk about some of the issues. Do you feel anxious? Do you feel uptight? Do you feel angry? And I found that it really helps the students, based on their feedback, to identify what they're feeling first and what their preconceived ideas are first. And then they can acknowledge those, process those, and then move on to doing analysis. And I found that it's really helped them to be able to think through better than just cognitive techniques alone. So I'll stop there because I don't want to cut into the time of my colleagues, but that's just an example of how I use it in my work. And so finally, I wanted to note this tree here. So I don't know, I guess it's kind of small. I know you guys can't see, but I have handouts for you. So C-Mind, which is an organization focused on contemplative practices, which Dr. Chapman will talk about later, has this really fantastic website, cmind.org, and on there are lots of resources for folks who are interested in contemplative practices. And one of them that really helped me out was this tree of contemplative practices. And let me pass this out to you all super quickly. Let me pass that to the other two ladies there. Thank you. Sure. So this tree has a lot of examples of contemplative practices that can be used in a classroom. Thank you so much, Megan. Lots of ideas. So anything from journaling, which I use a lot with my students, to bearing witness, to deep listening, to quieting the mind, to visualization. Lots of different contemplative practices that someone can use in the classroom. And I thought, well, you know, this is really interesting. Not all of these will work with my students and for my subject matter, but C-Mind, in their brilliance, provided, if you look on the other side of your sheet, a blank tree. So depending on what you're learning or what you're teaching, you can fill this in for yourself. So you can't really see it up here, and I'm sorry about that, but the bottom tree is the iteration that some colleagues and I put together that just focus on what's relevant for national security and intelligence. And so it was really helpful to me. So as I develop lesson plans and as I develop activities that I want my students to do, I can look at this tree and say, what is it that might align well with what I'm trying to get the students to learn for this particular project? And it's been very helpful. So I encourage you all to think through this and think about some things that may be useful to you. And with that, I will pass things on to Professor Levere.
Good morning, Happy New Year. You're all excited for a new semester?
All right. Students are coming.
I don't know. That was like some of the students. But good morning to you all. Thank you all for being here. I'm excited to talk about contemplative practices. And let me just take you through my journey. So it started off just really around kind of reaction to some of the students. There was one year where students were just really presenting as high anxiety. I mean, just they were just coming in. You could just, it was the energy was really frenetic. They were just unable to concentrate sometimes. I mean, I had one student, bless her heart, in the middle of class, she left out, had a panic attack in the bathroom. I had to cut the course short so I can go and tend to that. So just really high anxiety. And so some of that was just introducing just these mindfulness practices, just some breathing practices, just to kind of get them to center to focus before we started class. That's how it initially started. So it was really, again, in reaction to how students were presenting. But one of the things that I found was that students were responsive to the breathing exercises. At first I was a little hesitant, you know. So we're going to take a few minutes. I need you to sit back in your chair, and they will start looking at you rather oddly. What is this about? I'm paying for this. How long is this going to take? But what I found was that students were really responsive to it. And so I've continued to use it, starting off with, again, just the breathing exercises, which is a central part of what I do. But students are responsive to it. And like I said, students will now ask for it, which I think is fantastic. They'll come in, can we get a breathing exercise? If you all want it, please, let's do it. Because that means if we go through this, they're going to be able to be present for what we need to do. So I find that to be very helpful. And some of the responses have been, this has been really helpful for me. This is something I can also incorporate in my own practices. I tell them this is not something we have to wait for here. You can do this at any time. This is free. It doesn't cost anything. And it's also something, because I'm in social work, so this is also something it's trauma-informed and it's evidence-based, and it's also something that we're using within the field. So it also gives them exposure to techniques that they can use also with clients. So that was the part of how we started. That's the breathing piece. But I moved from just the breathing piece to this contemplation piece, so these other practices. And that was a process for me. How do I get to these other pieces in order to make it intentional and a part of the pedagogy? And so now there's exercises, and if you look at this tree, for us, when I looked at this tree, it was helpful because there were certain practices for social work and for some of the other change professions that there was natural synergy between them. So when we talk about engagement, it's really important for us as practitioners, how do we engage with others? So how do I get present with other people? And so it's interesting, we have exercises, and again, I do this with intention, so I build it into the curriculum. So what are the exercises around interviewing? Okay, so that sounds very simple. So we talk about techniques, but how do I just sit with the person? And for some of our students, they've been together for a period of time, so they have relationship with one another. So one of the assignments that I will have them to do is I will have them to, they'll pick a partner. Again, they're usually familiar with each other. Great, on a scale of 1 to 5, how are you feeling? 5 being I'm feeling really comfortable, 1 I'm not feeling comfortable at all. So, this is easy right now. Okay, what's next? And then so now I just want you to sit there. So they're sitting across from one another. And it's really interesting. It actually makes me chuckle almost every time. Because after just a couple of minutes, and I use that in my head, I think we're going to do this for about 2 minutes. I have yet to make it to 2 minutes. Because at 1 minute, and sometimes at 30 seconds, I get students that are looking back at me like I've fallen asleep or something, like, oh, do you realize we're still sitting here? But that's also important, because if they're talking about engagement, and you're talking about being present with others, how comfortable are you with that? And it starts off very simple. It seems simple, but when you start, and that's just not talking. So when you talk about a client who's presenting issues and things of that nature, how do you still stay present in that moment? So that's one way that I kind of use these practices that are helpful. Like I said, again, being intentional, like with what Professor Thomas says. What are some of these practices that are going to help them to be present for right now? And one of the things that I've also found for students is that it helps them to be focused. It helps their attention, which is really important, because we know the attention span of all of us in general right now is getting shorter and shorter. So how do we help them to be present, to be focused, to increase their attention? And one of the things that's really important for me, certainly the learning objectives are important, but one of the overarching goals for me is their critical thinking ability. I don't know about some of you all, but they're jumping to A to Z in ways that are just like, help me to understand how you got there. And so the process is important as well. So what's that cognitive process that you're using to get from here to there? And so this helps them to be able to think a little bit more, to also to be able to be reflective and to develop some self-awareness. How are you getting there? What, just like that was just mentioned, what was some of your thought process? What were you feeling about that? Because that's going to impact their problem-solving ability, their ability to be able to hear the different situations, and their ability to be able to hear different perspectives. So it can also broaden worldview. And so that's another way to use it. When we're talking about tough subjects, and when we're talking about things like race and gender and socioeconomic status, those are really difficult subjects, and those bring up a lot of things for people. So how are you all able to be able to hear the different perspectives? So sometimes it is somebody is speaking, I don't want you to respond immediately. You just need to sit still, hear it, hold it for a minute, and then you can respond afterward. Now, I don't know about some of your students too, they were super excited, so you ask, what's 1 plus 1? Green! Thank you for your excitement, however. So when we're on our on days, so can it really be green? And how come? On those days where we may be a little bit off, as the instructor, really, how did you get there? But help them to be able to focus. So to think a minute before you respond. Sometimes before they respond, I need you to write it down. Take 2 minutes to write it down so that they can think their thought through before they're just automatically responding because they're not really listening. They just want to jump out there and respond. So those are some of the ways that the practices can be helpful. So it's about how they show up. But I think it's important for us as the instructor as well. How do we show up? What is it that we hope to get out of this this process? This is an interactional process that takes place between the students and us. So what does that process look like? And some of us, frankly, we're here for the research part of it. The teaching piece is is an add-on. So what does that mean for how we are engaging with that student process, with that learning process? What is it that we hope to be able to get from? So it's important for us to think about how do we show up for the process. So if I ask you really quickly, how do you all show up? What do you all do to show up?
Exude energy,
Okay.
and enthusiasm.
Yeah, wonderful. That's important, right? Yeah, because if we're dry and don't want to be there, it impacts the room.
You feel the students feed off of that energy that you're putting out, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Sure.
Anybody else?
I typically teach at night.
Me too.
So, and I teach at 5:30. So at 3, I get myself to a coffee shop. Nobody knows where I am.
Yeah,
And I listen to music.
Yeah.
And I think about what I'm going to say.
definitely.
So when I show up, I don't have lingering stuff from my email or anything.
Definitely, yeah, and that's important. I teach a 7 p.m. class, so those are the students that have worked all day, all of that. So they need, So how we show up is important too. So it's important for us to think about what is it that we're exuding that impacts the dynamic, which takes us to the learning environment. How do we have an environment that produces more critical analysis? Deeper reflection. To me, that's really important because, again, that's going to get to that critical thinking piece, which is, again, a place that we want them to be able to do no matter what the profession is. The critical thinking needs to be there. So how do we increase those opportunities for critical thinking? I'll give you one other example. I was having a conversation on social justice, and we've had these conversations, throughout every semester, and I was trying to think of a different way to introduce the subject. And one semester, I introduced it in a way that was very different. It was from a contemplative perspective. So what I had them do, what I brought in was colored pencils, papers, what do you call those, when you stick things on?
Stamps?
Posters, stickers.
You stick them on things. That's what
Stickers. And so I brought all these things in, and this was a different way for us to have the conversation. So I asked them to do a visual of what they think social justice looks like. Gave them no instruction on it. They can do it any way that they wanted to. And what I noticed was a couple of things, and one was around process. And I never told them they couldn't talk, but it was really quiet in the room. Because they were working at their task quite diligently. And it was interesting too, because there was almost like there was a reference in the room. A student came in late, and this student is a talker. He was kind of, always the one who's always clowning and what have you. Even he came in, was very quiet, must have noticed the tone in the room, and very quietly, can I have that crayon? Or can I have that pencil? So the process was interesting because they were quiet, they were focused, and what they produced really changed the conversation in a way that would have been very different, that was very different than some of the other ways that I've introduced the topic. And so I thought that was a very helpful way to be able to introduce this very difficult topic, a very large topic, to get their different perspectives. And one of the things that I noticed as well is that they were very eager to demonstrate. I thought a few people would want to talk about, this is my picture, this is what it means for, but literally the whole class went through, well, I want to show mine too, this is what it means. But it was fun, because again, we had a richer conversation around this concept, and they were able to reference each other's ideas in a different way than I've had the conversation before. So those are just some examples for me around how contemplative practices can go beyond the breathing to how we really are intentional and deliberate about how we create opportunities for them to be self-reflective, to be thoughtful about their experiences.
Thank you, Professor Levere. So we will move on now to Professor Margolin to share her remarks with us.
Welcome. Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks especially to for joining us. I want to ask you a question first before we start. So I want to ask you, and you feel free to jot this down or just reflect for a moment. Why are you in this session this morning? You had 10 options. Why did you choose this one? Part 2 of that question, what are you hoping to take with you when you step out of the room?
So I've been practicing yoga and meditation, and I noticed the benefits of that practice for myself. And I want my students to benefit from it as well. The second part is how to bring that to class, because I haven't really figured that out. How to start it. I'm just a little scared of what they're going to think, and so that's the point of it.
Awesome. Great.
I have 2 reasons. One of them is I'm going to teach remedial students this semester, and they are repeating the course second time, so I want to help them how to get rid of their negative feelings of failure, maybe through mindfulness, some contemplative thinking. And another reason is the classes start at 8 a.m. So they need to, have a refresh mind before I introduce them the grammar, writing. So this is why I'm here.
Been reading about how students are dealing with different levels of anxiety because of where their direction may or may not be going, the burden of college debt, the ambiguity of what type of career they'll get after they graduate. And so I figured that this might be a good seminar to learn about just having a feeling or status of homeostasis within the classroom to try to mitigate some of that potential anxiety.
So I work in SIS abroad, so not teaching in a classroom, but a lot of people sort of say, oh, you go study abroad and it changes your life, but it's being mindful and contemplative of like the changes and things that you're experiencing while you're abroad. So I was part of preparing students to go. I want to sort of give them some of these tools so that they're not just, oh, I've spent a semester in Prague and now it's over and what did I get from it, but so that they can like day to day reflect and sort of have more mindful interactions with the world around them.
Take one more.
I took a mindfulness based stress reduction class, and I need to know how to do it, sustain that on a regular basis, and also share that with my students because they come in different frames of mind. I'd like to sort of bring us all together through mindfulness for 75 minutes.
Thank you. And yes to all of that. So I'll share just a little bit, about myself and then what I'm doing with these practices. So my name is Alyssa Margolin. I teach in the Department of Health Studies. I come not from the world of academia, but as a global health practitioner. So I spent most of my professional career overseas, mostly in Africa and a little bit of time in Asia, mostly working on HIV. What am I doing here? So I teach a lot of global health. I teach a lot of foundational public health classes. I've also been a yoga practitioner for over 20 years, and I've been teaching yoga and mindfulness for over a decade. And so I arrived at AU at one of the summer version of this session, this workshop, this tutorial workshops, and this is my 5th year. So 5 years ago, I was presented with a bunch of data about our students, which you guys have probably also heard in some form. And there was a slide on mental health, and it sort of blew me away. It blew me away about the levels of anxiety and the levels of depression and the levels of feeling overwhelmed. And I have come to understand that that data is not unique to this campus, although our levels are slightly higher than they are for the national average on almost every data point. But it was sort of staggering, like 80–90% of students experiencing pretty significant mental health concerns, and that those concerns and their level of stress was had huge impact on their academics. And that their primary driver of stress, not surprisingly, was academia. So I saw this data like the day before I started teaching on my first day, and I thought, oh my goodness, well, if I'm about to become responsible for this tremendous level of stress, if academia is driving the primary driver of stress. And I thought, well, I feel somewhat morally compelled to respond if I can. And I had this toolbox of these practices and yoga practices, and they sort of all woven together. And I thought, if I can share this, and this would make some drop of a difference for some students, then I have to try. So I started similar to you with breathing practices in every class. And I have continued to do that now, every class that I have taught over the last 5 years, regardless of the subject. And I take 1 to 10 minutes max, but usually 1 to 3 or 4 minutes of something. And we'll often start with breath. But we do other things too. Sometimes I'll feel like, wow, the whole room is about to fall asleep. Like, we're gonna stand up and we're gonna do something in our body. Or we'll start with a writing exercise, similar to what I just gave you, a prompt. And I do this for a number of reasons. I do it, 1, because I think it creates a learning environment that's better for all of us. It allows the students to, if they don't have 2 hours to go sit before they come to class, which most of them don't, it allows them to just drop into, here we are, we've arrived together, and I have a moment to stop the frenetic everything else that's happening in my head. It allows us together to be intentional. So it's intentional presence in the classroom. For me, so it's helpful for me. It lets me drop in as the educator. I get a moment to catch my breath and to show up. And so I get to model, what do I mean by being present? What does this look like? I'm not looking at my emails up until the last second. I'm not doing one last phone call. I'm just being with my students, and I'm asking them to do the same. So it allows us to show up, and we set intention right from the beginning. So in the very first class, I asked them kind of the same questions. Why are you here? You had a lot of classes to choose from. Even if this is a required class, think a little more deeply. How does this class serve you? What are you hoping to get out of this class by the end? And we start from the very beginning, baking in intention to each class, to each day, but also to their overall experience. So that when things get stressful, when they bomb an exam in the class, they don't say, I picked the wrong major, I should never have taken this class, you're a terrible professor, whatever, wherever our minds can go. And they say, okay, I can grow from this. I can learn from this. There's actually a bigger point to why I'm here, and one exam doesn't really. So we start to set an intention around this. There's another definition. It's basically the translation of the Pali or Sanskrit word for meditation. The translation is open-hearted presence. And I really like that. And so I try to establish that in my classroom too, so that the students and I are more present and more intentional about why we're there and learning. But we're also listening to each other, building on what you were talking to. We're listening with more, not just open-mindedness, and we talk a lot in this academic space about our minds, but I'm also asking them to arrive with some compassion. So I teach health classes. There are often times when there are difficult things that we talk about in health that touch on some of their personal experiences. and I ask them to just come into the classroom aware that on any given day, someone is going to be feeling sort of uh-oh about whatever we're talking about, whether it's abuse or violence or any sort of health illness or disability, whatever it might be, and that it's going to touch a nerve for somebody almost every day. And so I ask them to come in, let's just be aware, let's be mindful of what might be happening, whether or not we ever hear about it. And so it starts to change the dynamic about our relation with each other. And I hear from students time and again that they do feel like I'm giving them a tool, and they're really grateful for that. And they tell me, I use this with my roommate when she has panic attacks. We lay down on the floor together and we practice that breath you were doing. So they're using it outside of academia, they're using it outside of their own lives. I hear from my student athletes, I get really nervous before an event. I just sometimes sit on the sideline and I do one of those practices. Nobody knows I'm doing it, and then I feel much better going into my game. But I also hear from them that they feel at the end of the semester like we had a community, like we really built a community that felt safe, that felt inclusive, where they felt like I cared about them enough to spend a little bit of time in the beginning, but they cared enough about each other. I hear from them like, wow, it was so helpful to get feedback, real-time feedback from my classmate about this project that I'm working on, because they get invested in each other and they're listening to each other and what they're trying to work on. So, that. And then in addition to that, it also starts to inform, and sometimes depending on the class, I teach a lot of classes in stress management, where we do a lot of experiential learning, and they apply things to their own lives, but also classes that aren't in the stress realm explicitly, they start to be a little bit more mindful about choices they make in their own lives too. So choices around who am I in relation with and why? Right? What is my intention for being in this sorority, or being on this team, or having this relationship with this person that's difficult? What is my intention? Do I want to stay with it? Can I be present for it, or is it not serving me anymore? They start to think about those things. They start to think about, what am I putting in my body? Am I having a balance between my work and my social life and my physical activity? All these things that start to lead to, over time, slightly healthier decision making around all these domains of their health. And I hear that from them sort of spontaneously. It surprises me sometimes when they say, hey, I actually listen when my best friend calls me from wherever. I actually showed up for the whole conversation in a new way. And I don't tell them that's going to happen, but it seems to just over time change, make some shifts. So I will stop there for now, but happy to answer any questions about how, why.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, we're going to move on to Dr. Chapman now, and I just want to say that we will probably forego our moderated discussion, so after you, Dr. Chapman, we'll open it up for a wide discussion with everyone.
Yep.
Okay, so passing it on to Dr. Chapman.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So great to be here with you all. This is a real treat for me in a couple of ways, not just as a professor, an educator, and someone who cares deeply about students and education, but also as a board member for the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. So actually, can you forward to the next slide?
Absolutely.
And then we'll come back to this.
You got it.
So C-Mind is a nonprofit organization based in Massachusetts. We have over 800 members who are professors, administrators, graduate students. We offer an annual conference, the Association for Contemplative Mind and Higher Education annual conference, and we also offer a summer session where educators from around the world actually come together for about a week and work on their syllabi, engage in contemplative practices together. We build community, we have an open mic, we go down to the bar at Fitzwilly's and do karaoke. I lead that charge. And it is just an incredible, it's like college for professors for a week, right? And it is incredible. We have our meals together. Both of you have been, so then you'll have to come this year. And it is just a wonderful resource. And this is where you can find on this website sample syllabi where other faculty have incorporated mindfulness and other contemplative approaches into their work. We have a webinar series where members in our community have led webinars on a number of topics. Compassion. I've done my webinar on mindfulness and contemplation as promoting social justice awareness, which I'll talk a bit more about. Just an incredible place with wonderful, rich resources. So I want to make sure I mention C-Mind because I think it has a lot to offer. So this is exciting for me because I think this is the future of education. And really the future is the past, because what we're talking about in terms of deep listening and being aware of our bodies and being present for one another and having compassion and telling stories and engaging in art, these are the ways that people have existed in the world from the beginning of time. And this is fulfilling for me because I'm an anthropologist. And so this work, this approach, this way of walking in the world is very aligned with my discipline and with just how I am as a person. As a child, my mother used to, and she did up until her transition a couple of years ago, she used to crochet. She'll sit at the table and crochet these wonderful blankets for everyone. They were colorful. Everybody in the family has at least two. Let me know if you need one. And as she's doing that, she's centering, she's praying, she's thinking about her family, she's thinking about her future. My grandmother would get up very early in the morning and she would have her time with the Lord. Do not bother her, right? That was her contemplative practice. And so I really love this because the tree, you can go back to the other slide, thank you so much. What the tree communicates to me is there are many ways that we can get in touch and we can be present for each other and we can engage in learning as a community together. So I really love that. What I want to talk a bit about is how I approach mindfulness and contemplative practices from the perspective of social justice, particularly racial justice. I teach in our Crime Justice and Security Studies program at the University of the District of Columbia. And let me just share a bit of context with you first. Black children comprise about 19% of all preschoolers in this country, yet they make up about 48% of preschool suspensions. A recent study said that, or showed that black girls as young as 5 are perceived as being older, less innocent, and less in need of nurturing and protection than white girls of the same age. A similar study showed that black boys as young as 10 are perceived as being older and more threatening than white boys. We know that black children are over-policed, over-suspended, over-incarcerated, and overrepresented in all of the poor social indicators: health, education, all of them. If you hadn't noticed, I'm a black woman. I'm a black mother. I'm a black educator. I'm an artist. And these statistics, they hurt and they're alarming. And quite frankly, they're enraging. I'm also a spiritual person. I'm a contemplative. I meditate. I pray. And so these practices have served me personally with holding these two realities, right? The reality that there is real suffering in the world. There is very real and particular suffering from my community and my black children, my nieces, my nephews, my daughter, right? My brother, whom I lost at the age of 17 years old to gun violence in Washington, D.C., along with the reality that there is so much beauty and compassion and peace and joy in the world, in all communities, and we can be a community of peace and joy and compassion and justice. How do you bring those two together? Contemplative practices and mindfulness has allowed me to do that. And so I want to talk a bit about the pillars that I think are really important as you consider adopting these approaches and deepening these approaches in your work. First, I think these offerings have to be contextual, right? We have to look at them within the context of who's our client, who's our student, who are we serving, and why. Why do I want to bring these practices to students? They also need to be culturally responsive, right? My students, maybe they don't know a lot about yoga. Maybe those practices feel unfamiliar to them. But I can have them sit and think about someone in their family who is a mentor for them, someone whom they uphold, and dedicate their learning for the semester to that family member. Even a child or someone that's yet to be born. I do this in my restorative justice class. We think about, for whom do you want justice? For whom do you think justice should have been served in a different way? And we create a wall of honor in our classroom. And they bring photos, or they bring a poem, or they bring a newspaper clipping about someone, and we dedicate our learning to that person, to that cause, to that community for the semester. So contextual, culturally relevant, sometimes students themselves come up with practices. I think it's really important that these practices be decolonizing and anti-oppressive. I think it's important that we acknowledge the commodification of mindfulness and presence in meditation. I think it's important that we acknowledge that at one time the traditions and the cultures for whom this is part of their daily lived experience were denied the opportunity of practicing. Were denied the opportunity of having images and sculptures of their deities or their religious beliefs, right, because of oppression. I think it's important also that we tend to race, class, and gender differences within our classroom and within mindfulness spaces. So I've been to a lot of mindfulness conferences, trainings, contemplative sessions, and often, you know, these things are always present. Race, power, and privilege is always present, right? And so sometimes even in the mindfulness spaces, it looks like white men speaking up all the time, and white mansplaining mindfulness and contemplation and presence to others in the room. We have to acknowledge that. And if we are the practitioners, we should be able to do this, right? We should be able to hold these tensions and these difficulties with compassion, but also oriented toward justice and looking at how structures and systems and histories and damaging narratives, how we all have internalized them. It's important that we pay attention to trauma and that our practices be trauma informed, right? And this is not just as simple as not telling everyone to close their eyes, but that's really important, right? The way we invite people to practices, the way we consider other people and other body forms, and how we make these practices accessible and safe for folks. I think it's also important to be transparent with students, right? And not just say, okay, we're gonna close our eyes. Why? What is the aim of this? Why do you want me to do this, right? Particularly for our students who are mostly first generation, working class, or very low income students. Many of our students are undocumented. Some of our students have been incarcerated previously. Lots of our students come from very under-resourced communities. And so it's important to be transparent. So I share with students the research literature that says this supports your learning, this supports your well-being, this supports community, right? And there are many ways that we can show up and engage in these practices together. Sometimes it looks like bringing food to the 5:30 class and saying, hey, let's just be with each other for a few minutes. They love that, by the way, right? Let's be with each other for a few minutes. Let's talk together, right? And then let's just sit and sort of get ready for class. Here we are, right? Let's do that as a community without guilt, without shame. I'll note that I made a mistake here. This is a David Tree-Levin has a wonderful lecture and a webinar on the C-Mind website about trauma-informed practices. So it's not Treadwell, it's Tree-Levin. I'll also say that what I really appreciate from his teaching is that it really doesn't serve us when we think about trauma only in this very individualized way, but we have to even think about trauma from a very structural and systemic approach. So there are individuals for whom wage labor and working in unsafe conditions is the norm because that's the kind of work they can get. And these particular communities are sometimes more prone to being hurt on the job, laid off from the job, mistreated on the job, sometimes sexually abused on the job, right? So we need to think about trauma, not just from, oh, I'm so sorry, this thing happened to you, but how is our system perpetuating trauma against classes and groups of people? And then finally, I think practices absolutely have to be restorative and fun. I teach classes where a lot of times I'm sharing statistics and stories like the ones that I shared with you, right? And my students have experienced some of those things. And so we use practices to also just sort of lighten us up and to remind us that life is a wonderful journey. It's hard, but it can be a wonderful journey, and we can laugh and celebrate and dance and have karaoke and open mic and also fight for justice. So I'll stop there because I would love to hear your questions and have more dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues, so much. So I'm gonna jump from our presenter discussion to our open discussion. So I hope what you all have been able to pick up from the four of us is that these mindfulness and contemplative practices in the learning environment can be applied across the board. I mean, you have someone teaching social work, you have an anthropologist, you have global health, you have a national security person. So the beauty of it, I think, is that the principles are universal. They're adaptable, and they can be applied in the way that works for you, either as a learner. I'd love to hear from you students there. As a staff member, supporting and facilitating student growth and their experiences, and also as faculty members in the classroom or on an online classroom, and really helping to facilitate student learning, deep learning, and understanding of the material and of themselves. So with that, I would love to open it up and hear you all's thoughts and experiences with what we've talked about today. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much, because I think it takes a certain amount of fearlessness to start integrating these practices into what we teach. And I know for me personally, it took maybe 20 years of teaching to sort of come out and do this. And now I'm a professor in the School of Public Affairs, and I teach in key executive leadership programs too, and I design courses for the TSA Leadership Institute we do, and for the ICE Leadership Institute that we just started. And fundamental to, in addition to professors coming in and doing different subjects, we have what's called classroom coaching. And in the classroom coaching, we do teaching the inner and outer disciplines. So the inner disciplines are absolutely key to becoming an authentic leader. And the inner disciplines are mindfulness practices or other centering practices, reflection, and our institutes go for like 5 weeks, so we actually get them, and we have them, and they're captive. And I can't tell you how powerful it is. So now, even in the courses I teach here, say in the Key MPA program, they have, as part of their orientation, a day of mindfulness training, right? And I'm an executive coach, and I'm known as the Buddhist coach in this town. So, you know, people will say, I want you to be my coach, I need this stuff. And I was classically trained by a great Tibetan Lama. And so making the transition from my journey, because I feel like I'm a totally created person. This person helped me to work with my mind in a way that was beyond comprehension and beyond anything I can do for anyone else. But so making it secular has been my challenge. And in terms of leadership, kind of the journey I take people through is the importance of self-awareness, using mindfulness to develop inner compassion for oneself, because I find people to be very judgmental of themselves. And then how that leads to self-acceptance, and how that leads to authentic presence, and how that's absolutely critical for people to go on that journey. So it's going from the big me, I need this, I'm the center of the universe, to a much smaller me, and that I have to keep working on myself. But there's the duality between me and you sort of lens. So I call it the journey from me to we, which is a journey to developing collective intelligence and just being a source of energy. And it's very, very powerful, and there are so many correlates to mindfulness practice. I think really it's about teaching people the art of being a decent human being, making the unseen seen, right? And once you begin to understand how your mind works, and I also incorporate a lot of the neuroscience around this, and I recommend that people read books like Altered Traits by Goleman and Davidson, so you know, you can support. So for people that say, I don't believe this shit, I don't do this soft stuff, you know, you can say, well, you know, there's some real data around this. This is how it works on your prefrontal cortex, right? And so all this to say, I think this is the hard stuff now, it's not the soft stuff anymore.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and also I will share with you who my teacher was. And I felt like I was very young, I was at a stage in my life, starting when I was 9, thinking, if this is the quality of my life, I don't want it. I want to change it. And so I was very lucky to have Chogyam Trungpa as my root teacher, going to seminary with him and learning all the formal Buddhist practices around it. And really, I rewired my own brain. So I know this is possible. And so it's really important, I think, if you are going to do this stuff, that you do this stuff personally.
Thank you. I saw a hand here and then here. Yes.
So I'm just loving all of this so much. Thank you guys. So I teach an SOC, and like you, Professor Olivier, last semester I just saw the anxiety and the stress, and I just said we have to start doing something. So I did my first ever just like guided meditation at the beginning of class. I had some great feedback for it, and so now thinking about next semester, it's something I want to be doing just every class. So, but I'm also wondering, like, what are the tangible, practical things that you are doing besides breathing or meditation at the beginning of class? Is it something that you do? So I teach crisis communication. So like eventually then we need to like switch over to that. Do you just like switch over, or is it something that you leave throughout the class? Like, what are the tangibles, I guess?
I think for me, it's depending upon what the goal of it is, and I think, because I think this is a process of how you incorporate this, and it took, it's still a work in progress, quite honestly, for me, about what's your intention. So if you're going to use the practice that day, what do you hope to happen? Like, so that may determine whether it's something you're going to weave in. So that may be a reflective exercise during the process, or it may be just, we are going to do the breathing piece before because we're going to talk about something that's really difficult, so we just need to be present to be able to have that conversation. So I think it's about what it is that you want to be able to have happen for that particular day, and then what practice may be most appropriate for that activity or for that content for that day. I don't know if that helps you. That's a broad kind of.
Yeah, like my overall objective, like you were saying, is that just I want the learning environment to happen, and I feel like that is being blocked by the mind chatter and everything else. That's kind of like my primary objective.
Well, if I can add something to what Professor Olivier shared, I found that with all my classes, incorporating some type of journaling has been really helpful for students. Even students who are not feeling it at all have come to me at the end of the semester and said, I didn't like all that stuff at the beginning, but I'm so glad you made me do that. So journaling really helps with that anxiety piece too, because then they can put that down on paper. They can show it to you or not, but the process of them doing that and getting that stuff out on paper, I've found for some of my students has been helpful, particularly if you're teaching crisis communications. That might be a good practice for them too. Just a thought.
Something I can maybe add on to the journaling piece, depending on the context of the class, and if there's a time that's appropriate for students to jot down their top 3 anxiety-producing things, and then share with each other. And I have them do it on stick-it notes and put up on the board anonymously, not with their name, but then they just start to look and they're like, oh my God, everybody feels that. Everybody's stressed out by the same thing. And even just that is really powerful to be like, I'm not alone. Other people get it. We're kind of in it together, and just sort of naming, I found really helpful. There's a time to do something like that.
And opportunities to just celebrate or give yourself a little pat too. So I'll have my students occasionally share their wins for the day, and in some cases we've actually written them on the board. We still have blackboards at UDC in some classes, which I tend to like. So, you know, the win could be I got a parking space, or, you know, somebody bought my lunch, or I made it to class on time, or, you know, and we accumulate just a little corner of the board, these wins, these victories, right? Because we know, reading the neuroscience, that the brain has a negativity bias, and we overperceive negative things and tough things. We'll come back from a wonderful vacation in Greece and focus on the one thing that was to our displeasure, and completely, like, you were in Greece, right? And we do that too in our daily experience. So sometimes reorienting, right? But that doesn't mean not acknowledging the difficulties and the pain and the suffering, but also teaching them that you can acknowledge those things and then you can reorient and shift your attention, shift your awareness to something else.
Yeah.
Something that went well that day too, sometimes, yeah.
So we had a question here, and then we'll go back there in the corner.
Hi. So I teach first year students in the AUX course. So in the fall, that's kind of like a centering back on yourself. So it's really easy to incorporate this. I guess kind of like in the activities that we're doing, like it's not necessarily like intentional mindfulness. It's more just like the activity itself is already mindful, if that kind of makes sense. In the spring, we're talking more about like systems of oppression and like racism and things like that. And I'm kind of curious, like how, if y'all have experienced this with like tougher topics, if students are being, I guess kind of like putting up blocks for themselves because of the topic and because of the class and that it's a requirement and things like that, if they are also then putting up blocks to being mindful and engaging in those activities, if that makes sense, and kind of like how you break that down for the students, whether, I mean, I know some of you mentioned like showing them the research on like how it does actually impact them and improve their learning, but if you're still receiving, I guess, kind of that like resistance and like full roadblock, like how you get students to really engage, not only with, I guess, like being mindful and reflective, but also like the content that you're trying to get to eventually, if that makes sense.
That might be a new question back to
Just let me bring it Yes. You know, we're just so out of practice with talking about these things. We're so out of practice with approaching these things from historical and systemic perspective that it takes practice for our students to cultivate the capacity to hold that and to do that. And so I find that I have to be compassionate, right? Because just because I've spent all this time, you know, this is Rhonda McGee's new book, I don't know if anyone's seen The Inner Work of Racial Justice. Ruth King has a book called Mindful of Race. You know, lots of work. Beth Barilla writes about mindfulness and anti-oppressive work, Jennifer Cannon. So just because I'm steeped in this and I know about this and I've dealt, you know, I'm 50 years old, you know, I've cultivated a bit more capacity to sit with this and work through it. My students aren't there, right? So even that becomes part of the teaching, right? That it's hard to see these things. Yes. It really is. But they exist, whether we see them or not. So, you know, in this class, we're gonna work on seeing them, right? And I don't know if that's helpful, but it's a journey, it's a process, and definitely the subject matter affects their ability, their willingness to go deep and to look. But I think, you know, the benefit of mindfulness is that it really teaches us, it's not just about, you know, being quiet and being still, but it teaches us to watch our thoughts, right? It kind of makes us hip to what's going on inside of us, right? So we can become the observer of our thoughts. And so when we teach or when we work with students so they can develop that capacity, it almost helps them develop a bit of objectivity, right? So, you know, it's not all about you, it's about history, it's about what we've inherited, it's about how our systems and our institutions are structured, and yes, we're all part of it, we all play a role in it, but, you know, we don't have to personalize it and feel guilty or angry, although those feelings may arise, but it's really larger work that we're doing.
And I think part of it is to acknowledge that this is a difficult conversation and to be open to what it is that it brings up for us. That anger is going to come up, frustration is going to come up, but how do we still stay present with that conversation to be able to have the dialogue? We're going to have a difference of opinion. We just acknowledge that from straight up. There's going to be some variety of opinions here. Some of this is going to be more personal for others. But how do we create this space? And I ask them, how do we create this space so that we can begin to have this conversation, so that we can hear each other? And again, sometimes I'll ask them, they say something before you automatically respond. And this, I have to be mindful about this as well. My ex used to tell me before he would finish something, I'd be like, can I get it out first? And so I have to practice this too, so that, you know, when we're having these conversations, how can we, before we're automatically responding, what can we do just to stay still for a minute? Let me hear that. Let me think about what that meant. Let me hear your story before I automatically respond to that story. And that's a part of how we set up part of that conversation. And when it's bringing up really difficult things, what are we going to do with that? And I'm also very mindful about what do we need to do before we leave the room as well. So if this is going on, what do we need to do sometimes to close it up a little bit so that all of that is not out there, especially if it was something that was really intensive. What do we need to do to close it up before we leave?
I like that.
Just on a practical standpoint too, I would say in the practice, so if you're going to do breath work or journaling or some sort of exercise in the beginning, in addition to giving them some of the science, some of the research about why it works, I also say in the beginning of the semester and remind them regularly, this is voluntary. Right? So you don't have to close your eyes. Sometimes closing your eyes can be quite triggering, right? So you don't have to close your eyes. You could just lower your eyelids. If it makes you feel agitated to do the breath we're going to do, don't do it. Just let yourself have a moment that's quiet. Please don't hop on your email and start clattering away while everybody else is trying to do. But you don't have. And I say, some days we're going to do this practice, and it's going to feel awesome. And then we might do it tomorrow, and it's going to make you feel all. Because something's going on. You didn't eat breakfast. You didn't sleep last night. You just broke up with your partner, whatever. And they also just normalize that, like, some days this is going to work and some days it won't, and it's okay, and it's okay for you to not participate all that. And I think, like, just saying that out loud is also so that there's not that, like, I have to, and therefore I won't because you're making because I have to.
And I tell them, you all don't have to participate, But what I do say is, though, if you're not going to participate, just don't ruin it for somebody else. And that looks like sometimes, that kind of stuff like that. And so it kind of, gives a little levity, but people are invited. They don't have to. But what I noticed, though, is at least they're quiet. So, and that's helpful. So they may not even recognize that, they may not be doing the breathing, but it's a time where the room is quiet.
I'm going to make another really quick point that I didn't mention earlier. Another reason why I came to this contemplative practices and mindfulness in higher ed is because as a junior faculty member, I had a horrible conflict with another faculty, a senior faculty member. And it was incredibly painful, and I didn't feel like I got a lot of support. I didn't know what to do. And just running into that faculty member at the elevator triggered me, and I went into trauma response. And somehow I learned about this organization. And I was new to higher ed. I'm the first in my family to go to college and get a master's and a PhD. I didn't know anything about how painful and competitive higher education could be. And so through this community, through the contemplative community, I heard that I wasn't the only one dealing with these sorts of tensions in academia. And I found some resources and I found some support. So I just say that because, sometimes the one that needs the compassion and the support, we're in these environments that are sometimes not very friendly, right? There's power and privilege and competition, and you've got to publish or you've got to do something, and there's disparity in institutions and the research ones and the research 24s, those are also realities that we're dealing with, and faculty of color and other marginalized faculty, LGBTQ faculty, are doing all of this emotional labor to just be here and show up, right? So we need this stuff too, all of us and our students. So let's remember ourselves.
Absolutely. Thank you. We'll take one more back here and then we'll wrap it up. And then if anyone else has any questions or comments, we'll stick around for a while and answer them after. But I know we want to respect the time. Yes, ma'am.
My name's Carmen. Thank you so much for this. This was really exciting to hear and really informative. I work in academic coaching, and this kind of ties in with another previous question. A lot of students that come into my coaching sessions are coming in for help voluntarily. They're having some challenges in many different classes, and one of the things that keeps coming up is resistance. So it can be a resistance to going into a space that feels really uncomfortable, and frequently that space comes with this perceived outcome of a negative outcome. So when they're trying to tackle a hard assignment, an assignment that they perceive as hard that they've never done before, maybe they've had a bad outcome before, they initially feel this resistance, and then that leads to going into a self-soothing activity, which is often distraction-based, not refreshing at all. So one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about is creating space. They're very interested in the idea of creating space. They kind of find that like, well, I never thought, like I tried everything, I never thought to create just space. And then we talk about like sitting in that space and learning to be more comfortable in that space is actually something that I'm encouraging them to do, because I find that that will allow them to move to the next thing, which is actually move forward into the assignment and be able to coexist, have that duality of I am uncomfortable but I am empowered. But I'm struggling to tell them what to put in that space while they're building it. And so for many of them, surprisingly, even saying like just create, I'll tell them you can do the distraction, you can do the self-soothing. Whatever you decide you want to do, you can do. I'm not telling you not to do that, not asking you to do that. I want you to just see how long you can work on building the space between I am going to decide that I want to look, at my phone and distract, and I have that feeling of discomfort to the action, to the compulsion to veer. So I've been thinking, is it like, would it be like something like teaching breathing exercise? Like some students have responded really well to like, I just want you to journal for a minute or two, but I didn't know if you had any advice for that.
I think it's up to the individual, so to give them options. So what will help you to be able to sit in this space, and to help them to come up with, and if cause sometimes we struggle. Well, I don't really know. I don't understand what you mean by space. But to after you help them to define that. So what helps you to be comfortable? What helps you to kind of self-soothe? What helps you to be able to just kind of be thoughtful without a lot of distraction? And for some, that's going to take that's a process to think that through, because we're just so busy. We're moving all the time. I've really never thought about it. And then there may be some opportunity, well, here's some ideas. Well, what about journaling? What about breathing? What about, and let them kind of think that through. Or we can practice some different things for them and help them to determine what will be helpful for them. But we don't want to be prescriptive about it. This is what's going to work. They need to figure that part of that out for themselves. And how do we just kind of assist them to think that process through?
I think timing also helps, having some boundaries around time. I use 3-minute timers. Really, I was looking for one. I bring my just little plastic 3-minute egg timers with my students. So you can order them from Oriental Trading. They're very cheap. And it just gives them a visual. This is 3 minutes, so you can do your phone, but then after this, I want you to write for 5 minutes. Just get started on this assignment. And I'll tell you, when I wrote my dissertation, it was very painful. No one in my family had done it. I only had a couple of, folks around, my advisors, my faculty, wonderful. Words with Friends helped me. I said, I'm going to write a page, and then I'm going to get on Words with Friends. Because just going through that mental and intellectual exercise, it can be trauma-inducing, right? It's like, oh my God, am I smart enough? Does this make sense? I'm not sure. And I have to say her name, my advisor here, Dr. Rachel Watkins. During the process, I talked to him like, I'm not doing this well. This is not right. She's like, wait a minute. This process is not about what you don't know. It's about what you do know. And so creating that shift, it opened up a completely different door for me. This is not about what you don't know. This is about what you do know. And affirming with students, you do know stuff. You can do this. It's cultivating a growth mindset. Maybe you need some other skills. Maybe you need some more support, but you can do this. In one of my photos, I have a young man holding up a board, and it's a vision board. I do that with my students as they're about to graduate. These are first-gen students, Black males and females. Can they make it out there in the world? Can they get a job? I have them create images, and we do meditation around it. So just using all the tools. So sometimes time is helpful.
Did you want to say something? Just one more thing. There's a quote on my slide that I didn't share with you, this quote by Viktor Frankl, that basically says, in the space between the stimulus and what we do with that is our choice, and in that choice lies our freedom, right? So I applaud you for creating that space, because that's hugely empowering. And it really, that feeling of choiceless or out of control is what drives so much of our stress and our anxiety. So reclaiming that sense of control over that I have a choice. And even the choice of what to do with the space is empowering. And there are a couple of other just quick tools, but creating an anchor in your body. So just doing a body scan, where in my body is my tense? And then just noticing, oh, I'm doing this, and relaxing that. And that can take 1 to 10 minutes. And just relaxing from your head to your feet or your feet to your head. Or an anchor of sound. Just, I'm going to listen to all the sounds around me. I do that sometimes with my students and they're like, oh, we have a clock in this room. I never noticed because they hear the ticking of the clock. But just that, like, and that's a distraction because your mind's not ruminating. It gives you something to do, but it's like very calm. So those are just 2 simple ones that you could also.
Well, I'd like to thank my fellow presenters here, and I would like to thank all of you all for being so engaging. I'm looking at your faces, everyone's talking. You guys are really good listeners because I can see it in your faces. So thank you for being a part of this session. I hope you can walk away with something that you can use, and I wish you all well. Thank you all for being here.